Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. I apologize again for being late, and I missed the session earlier today. I thank the organizing committee for this opportunity. So it was a tricky subject that I needed to think about when we talked about the heart failure reduced ejection fraction. I felt like, we've been discussing this for ages now. Everybody knows the indications for CRT and the high voltage devices. But when it comes to preserve ejection fraction, that's a completely different ballgame. So when we talk about heart failure, I think we all know that heart failure is a clinical syndrome consisting of signs and symptoms, which are related to elevated intracardiac pressure or inadequate cardiac output at rest or during exercise. So when we talk about device therapy in heart failure, we're talking about years and years of research. Sorry about this. With a main focus in hardcore outcomes, so we're putting as objectives a reduction in mortality, a reduction in heart failure hospitalization, and improving the functional capacity and the quality of life of these heart failure patients. So when we talk about device management in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, I think we all know that we have the high voltage devices on primary prevention and secondary prevention. Secondary prevention, these patients are high-risk patients who already declared themselves as high risk, either by having sustained arrhythmia, ventricular tachycardia, or sometimes even out of hospital cardiac arrest, and the setting of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. Primary prevention was, after so many different trials, figuring out that reduced ejection fraction was actually linked to sudden cardiac death, and a huge number of these patients is actually related to arrhythmia. So when we talk about patient selection in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, we're talking about New York Heart Association class. So these patients need to be symptomatic before we consider them for device therapy. We talk about left ventricular ejection fraction, and 35% seems to be the cutoff accepted. I think these might change, especially with the introduction of cardiac MRI when it comes to risk stratifying these patients. And QRS duration, wide and narrow QRS duration, where wide would be preferred for CRT device, and narrow QRS complex would be for the defibrillation part of it only. So the more interesting part of the topic, I think, is the heart failure with the preserved ejection fraction. These are the patients who we see frequently in our practice. They constitute up to 50% of heart failure patients in general. And they have other risk factors and comorbidities. And they have very limited choices of drugs, and they have also, unfortunately, very limited choices of devices to help these patients. So we don't see these devices in the guidelines, or a big chunk of them, we don't see them in the guidelines yet. However, some interesting research is ongoing, and some devices are showing a great potential for improvement for these patients. So we're going to talk about the implantable heart failure monitors, cardiac contractility modulation, interatrial shunt device, parareflex activation therapies, and left atrial pacing to correct the interatrial dyssynchrony. So when we talk about the CardioMEMS, for example, like the heart failure pressure monitor device in the that is implanted in the pulmonary artery. It is used to measure the changes in the heart failure And it has proven evidence that it can detect early changes in pressure inside the heart way before the symptoms of heart failure actually appear. We're talking about the Champion clinical trial, and it showed a significant reduction of heart failure hospitalization based on the therapy guided by this device. It did find its place in the guidelines, unlike the other therapies we're going to talk about. So when we talk about the cardiac contractility modulator, most of the time it's used when patients are having a narrow complex QRS. It's a device that can deliver a high energy impulse at the absolute refractory period in the myocardium. And doing so, especially in the septal area, can actually result in improving contractility by increasing phosphorylation, increasing the influx of calcium inside the myocyte. And it helps in improving the quality of life of patients. Very small trends towards improving the ejection fraction and improving the rate of hospital readmission. However, we lack strong evidence when it comes to mortality, and I think we need more evidence for it to be visible in the guidelines. So these are the small trials related to the cardiac contractility and heart failure preserved ejection fraction. And as we mentioned, nothing is actually improving the mortality of these patients. It's only a quality of life improvement and a very small group of patients that showed an improvement in the ejection fraction. When we talk about the inter-atrial shunt, it's a very promising intervention that we can offer for patients with heart failure and preserved ejection fraction. The idea is that you're actually shunting some of the pressure from the left to the right. And this helped in improving the quality of life for these patients, and it reduced the heart failure hospitalization. So the most well-studied is the Corvia device for this purpose. However, as we can see, there are a lot of devices that are being studied in order to reduce the pressure from the left to right, thus helping these patients and improving their symptomatology, and hopefully improving the rate or reducing the rate of readmissions. Baroreflex activation therapy, a very interesting concept where you stimulate the ganglia and the baroreceptors, thus reducing the feedback from them and reducing the pressure. It have a positive impact on the renin-angiotensin system and the feedback for that system to the heart. Again, still early stages, no hardcore improvement. Like when we were talking about mortality, we haven't actually had any improvement of mortality for these patients. However, significant improvement in the quality of life. So if we want to summarize the devices that we use in heart failure, as you can see, the ones that has colors are the ones that are currently indicated. As we mentioned, the monitoring for pulmonary artery pressure, when we're dealing with patients with reduced ejection fraction, it has a class 2B indication. When we're talking about devices like CRT, we all know the indications for them. However, the other devices that we spoke about, they don't have yet a strong presence in the guidelines. I think interventions like the inter-atrial shunt are actually being practiced in some centers and showing very good results. So in conclusion, heart failure is a major global public health problem with substantial morbidity and mortality. Guideline-directed medical therapy is the key for management when it comes to reduce and preserve ejection fraction. Device therapy for heart failure with reduced ejection fraction as being studies that have been in the market for quite some time, and we know they can impact their mortality and improve the rate of hospital readmissions. Unfortunately, we lack the same when it comes to heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much.